And so there was a huge insurrection still going on, and there was a hardcore right-wing people that were clamping down on all the Vietnam protesters, et cetera. At Fort Hamilton, to build a major platform, and General Higgins had to get up in front of the entire assembled First U.S. Army and apologize to the women that he had insulted in his deposition, right? And Jack Weinstein signs this order, right? And so we end up go back home. Of course, then the word comes down to the law firm, that I've been involved in this particular case.
They don't like that.
And so anyway, that the Court of Appeals reversed the part about him having to put up the bandstand.
Oh, he didn't have to do that.
But he had to post. He had to post in conspicuous places throughout the grounds. The apology to them. But the bottom line is, it was cases like that I was doing in the other halftime. But the other halftime, I was doing stuff for the New York Times and NBC. Yeah. And so the bottom line is, I left and went to Bailey's office instead, and right directly to Bailey's office in Boston.
To bring this back, F. Lee Bailey, as you said, called you on like June 21st, shortly after the Watergate break-in.
Yes.
Now, Watergate is another case that obviously at the time was covered extensively. It's constantly cited in basic parlance when we discuss things politically.
Yeah.
But the details and the timeline of the case and how it played out is often totally forgotten about the history. So can you just walk people through exactly what happened here?
Sure. No, it's interesting because these cases were all kinds of things that are so real to me, and it must be for like a lot of the young kids. It must be like the American Civil War. The Civil War, the American Revolution. They're all kind of back in there.
I didn't say you were that old, Dan.
There's
Come on.
Watergate back in there. But so what happens is Richard Nixon. Remember, Richard Nixon in 1960 was the vice president under Eisenhower.
That's right.
He'd become the Republican nominee for the presidential nomination in 1960. He lost the election to John Kennedy.
Right.
John Kennedy came in and went through that entire era. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd of 1963. And Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And Lyndon Johnson then runs in 1964, in November of 1964, and is elected for his first term. It goes all the way to 1968. Lyndon Johnson has cranked up the Vietnam War. He's engaged in massive war crimes against the people of Southeast Asia. People are in the streets rioting against him here in the country. The bottom line is 1968, there's this election getting ready to take place, and it was going to be Lyndon Johnson against Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was going to come back and run against him. And then we were trying to. I was at Harvard Law School by that time, and there were a bunch of us that were trying to get Bobby Kennedy to run against Johnson for the Democratic nomination. Bobby wouldn't run against an incumbent like that. A number of my professors were working with him in his campaign. Anyway, the bottom line is, Bobby just finally said he wasn't going to do it. So we had Joe Grandmaison and Gary Hart went and met with Gene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, to have him run against Lyndon Johnson. And in the first primary up in New Hampshire in January of 1968, Senator McCarthy, almost beat Lyndon Johnson. The opposition to Johnson was so intense. And Johnson comes out and announces that he's decided he's not going to run. Bobby comes out right away and says then he's going to run. And so Bobby starts campaigning for the campaign in 1968. And then in April of 68, Martin Luther King is killed. Then the day of our first exam, of our final exam at Harvard Law School, June 13th of 1968, Bobby is shot and killed in Los Angeles. Spends a whole day lingering before he dies. But and so then this horrific demonstration takes place at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where the Senator Humphrey who was the vice president under Lyndon Johnson, was going to ascend to be the candidate for the Democratic Party. In the tens of thousands of young Americans gathered in Chicago and laid siege to the convention.
They laid siege.
They did. They encircled the entire place. There were tens of thousands
with
of
weapons
the people.
and stuff?
No. There was no weapons.
You say siege, Danny. I started thinking weapons.
No, they were just marching around and opposing them and chanting and everything. And the Chicago police were turned loose on them by Mayor Daley. And they just had a police riot, and it was officially found, as a matter of fact, that the police had just rioted and attacked the demonstrators, and it was mayhem at the convention. And Richard Nixon ends up winning in the presidential campaign against Hubert Humphrey by no. He ended up winning by less than 1%.
Oh, I didn't know
the vote.
that.
Oh, yeah, I know.
No.
That was in '72
that's
against
right.
McCarthy or against McGovern.
Yeah.
No. This was a super tight race, even against Hubert Humphrey.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, very important piece. So he just wins by a hair's breadth, and comes in and is super unpopular. Because he's such an arch reactionary, and everybody who's opposed to the Vietnam War hates him, and so that it was a very unpopular presidency.
Quick question on
yes.
that. I'm just curious because it does technically change parties at that point.
Yeah.
You had said this earlier, how some of the attitudes on like Vietnam and on different wars, obviously past president to president. I think we saw that again with Bush to Obama to Biden, even to Trump to an extent. And, at that time, why did Nixon take on the stance that was so, I might be cherry picking here to say this, but so similar to Johnson? Was it simply like Intel walked in the office day one and said, look, sir, you're going to have to do this? Or did he actually believe we needed to be there?
Well, he was, you got to understand, it was back in 1954 that we originally went in to take over from the French after Dien Bien Phu. He was the vice president. In 1954 under Eisenhower. And he ran the 54-12 committee, which ran all covert operations and stuff. So he was intimately involved in the CIA operations in Vietnam. So he was one of the original architects of the whole insurgency operation that was going on in Vietnam. So when he came into office in 1968, even though it was 8 years later, he had been one of the major instigators of the whole war in Vietnam. So he was in full-throated support of this whole operation.
But he didn't you know how politicians, they change their opinion with the wind based on where it's blowing. He didn't change his opinion at all, despite all that?
He just kept hammering down more and more and more.
We're going to go in there and rain down hell on him.
Just like with Johnson, and ended up, bombing into Cambodia and doing the Tet, the response to the Tet offensive, all that, all of that horrible stuff was going on, and the people were rising up. The young people were all rising up against Nixon in 1972. And so there was a huge insurrection still going on, and there were the hardcore right-wing people that were clamping down on all the Vietnam protesters, et cetera. And there was a kind of an air of potential civil war sort of in the air at the time.
Interesting.
And the problem is that the candidate that was selected by the Democratic Party in 1972 was George McGovern. George McGovern was a sweet South Dakota, very progressive senator, and was very articulate against the war, and was carrying the banner against the war. But nobody thought that he had a real chance to be able to beat Richard Nixon, except that all of a sudden this weird thing that they're in the midst of the campaign. They have 1972 in June. They have the conventions. Nixon gets the nomination. McGovern gets the nomination. They're going through the whole motions, and then all of a sudden this weird thing happens. Nixon's kind of on the roll, heading into being assumed to be elected president. All of a sudden, this Watergate break-in happens. And word goes out that there had been this peculiar event has taken place, that these four Cubano guys and an American CIA person had been arrested in the Watergate Hotel. They had burglarized the Watergate Hotel, which was the head of the Democratic National Committee headquarters there, and nobody could figure out what exactly was going on. And there was a little bit of a flurry of news stories about it going on. But we were into June now, so there was just the July, August, September, campaigns rolled on. The election comes down, and in November, Nixon ends up winning in a huge landslide. Wins all but like 2 states. I think it was Massachusetts and California. The only
Sounds
ones
right.
that voted for McGovern. And the bottom line is he comes into office and immediately starts slamming down on Vietnam, doing all the same stuff he was doing. But then these 2 young reporters on the Washington Post start digging back into the story. I was brought on by Bailey to work on the case.
But he had called you way back when it happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I ended up coming down there later in the fall and started investigating it. I was saying, now, what the hell is going on here? I said, that by that time, the Washington Post had started having a number of stories about it.
And this is fall of 72.
This is the fall of 72.
Okay.
And that they then brought in a special select committee in the House and Senate on Watergate to investigate what was going on, because they were starting to reveal things in the Washington Post about the connections between the people that were in the Watergate Hotel and the president's office. Okay, so at that time, people weren't paying a lot of it. It was like kind of stuff going on sort of in the background. But when I got involved in it, I started saying, I need to find out what happened here. If I'm being asked to participate in this, I need to find out what happened. What in the world are 3 of these Trafficante gunmen doing in the Watergate Hotel? What has that got to do with anything? And I started investigating it and found out that Bailey was the attorney for Santos Trafficante. And so I said, oh, look, Trafficante obviously must know what his guys are doing in there. So let's find out what's going on. So we have Bad Andy Tunney, who was our chief investigator. That he was the head of a thing called Moriarty and Associates. It's got 40 Class A licensed private investigators that are at our disposal at the Bailey firm, right? And he goes and sits down. He goes down to who was it, down in Tampa?
Tampa, yeah.
Over in Tampa, and over in Chuck Gonzalez. Henry Gonzalez, Hank Gonzalez. Hank Gonzalez's office brings in Trafficante and brings him over to Hank Gonzalez's house.
And this is when he's the Don.
Yeah, he's the Don. He's the Don of Havana. He's up in Tampa because he's fled back in January of '59 when Batista was overthrown.
Yeah.
So he's up there. So that they bring him over to Hank Gonzalez's house, and Bad Andy spends the weekend with him, interviewing him in the guest house, and gets the story about what's happened here. And he ends up telling us that what's happened. And what we discovered is that the reason that, in fact, it had been Nixon himself that had personally ordered them to go into the Watergate Hotel. It wasn't just a brain fart or something on the part of the plumbers unit. That this was actually ordered by Nixon himself.
He's telling you.
Yeah, this is Trafficante is being very clear about this. That this was ordered by Nixon himself, because Nixon was terrified that the Larry O'Brien, Lawrence O'Brien, had just been made the head of the new head of the Democratic National Committee that June, and was going to be supervising the campaign against Nixon. And it turns out that Larry O'Brien, prior to being made the head of the Democratic National Committee, was the 20-year chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes.
Oh, shit.
And it turns out that Howard Hughes is the guy back in 1960
Yep.
when Richard Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower, and realized that he was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party for the presidential nomination in 1960 against John Kennedy. He reached out and contacted Howard Hughes, excuse me, who was a secret consultant to the National Security Council of the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. He was responsible for designing the Glomar Explorer, which was this special ocean-going ship that had the capacity to reach down to the bottom of the seafloor and pick up submarines. So in case a Soviet submarine had become disabled and incapacitated, that we would be able to go recover it and recover the technology that's in the submarine, et cetera. He had also done the Spruce Goose, which was the prototype to the C-5A cargo plane. He set up a thing called the Summa Corporation, that was a corporation where they did covert technical work for the CIA and NSA. Anyway, he was a contractor, a secret contractor. There were a few other programs he was involved in. It won't help to talk about. But the bottom line is that Nixon reached out to him on the secure phone from the 5412 Committee, which is the section of the National Security Act of 1947 that ostensibly authorizes them to engage in other activities from time to time at the behest of the president. And they deemed that as being the source of their authority to engage in covert operations, what they call kinetic action.
Yeah.
And so that Nixon reached out on the secure phone to talk to Howard Hughes, asking him to set up a political assassination team to kill Fidel Castro
in 1960.
In 1960, June.
While he's vice president.
Well, he's vice president, right? And so he asked that be set up, and that Howard Hughes takes steps to keep it away from the White House so that it doesn't get tracked back to the White House. So Howard Hughes doesn't agree or disagree in the telephone call, according to Trafficante, but he ends up hanging up, and then he calls in Bob Mayhew, one of his lawyers, and says to Mayhew, here, you take this. Nixon's getting set to be president now. He wants to have this assassination team put together to kill Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and these other 5 comandantes that are the head of the new revolutionary government in Cuba. And so we want to keep this away from the White House. So Bob Mayhew reaches out to Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli is there in Las Vegas where Howard Hughes was.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.